So we've talked a little bit about groups going along with authority and compliance. How in general do we just work in groups when there's not necessarily something you need to request from them? There are a couple different things that happen. So the first is social facilitation. So just the presence of other people around you is going to change how you behave. It facilitates different behaviors. So this is really, really common, for instance, in the show Community. So just by having other group members around you might make you better at studying than you would have if you're by yourself, or, acting just on your best behavior, those types of things. So for instance, I typically do my homework at home in my pajamas, but if I was working in a study group on campus, I would, be more put together. I'd put on outside clothes, that type of thing. In addition, though, I am sure you have experienced this working in groups, the idea of social loafing. So people loafing around is a term for having just kind of reduced motivation, not really pulling your weight. So when you're working in a group, there tends to be this reduced effort and motivation because other people will do it, right? Like, you don't need to put in all the effort that you would have otherwise put in because someone else will pick up the slack, right? So this is the thing that tends to happen, whereas if you're doing individual assignments, that person will put in more effort. Also, de-individuation. So this is an anonymity. You're taking away kind of your individual identity when you're immersed in a large group. So for instance, maybe if we were doing a one-on-one meeting, if you came to office hours or so, we might stay on task, we might have a good conversation, but when you're watching the lecture, or you're sitting in a large class, you might scroll through your phone or kind of surf Facebook in the background, right? So because you're more anonymous when we're in a large classroom, you're feeling more like you can do your own thing. No one's really going to notice you or see what you're doing, right? Same is true when you're, asking questions to a large class over Zoom and people don't really respond, even if they know the answer, because you're like, I'm anonymous. No one's really going to pay attention to me. I don't need to be the one person, someone else will do it, that kind of thing. So yeah, de-individuation is also a thing. And a couple more. So we have seen this come to light so much in our American politics recently. Group polarization. So this is the intensifying of an original attitude following discussion. Have you ever tried to have a political argument over Facebook? I am sure you've seen this attempt. You're not going to get anywhere, right? Chances are both you and that person are going to leave the conversation even more set in your original viewpoints than you came in with. This is called group polarization. So there are a couple different reasons this might end up happening. We kind of have this consistency desire that once we have this view about a thing, we're going to stick to that view, no matter if we have conflicting evidence, right? So this is huge in politics. And then lastly, groupthink. So this is flawed thinking, flawed decision-making, in which the group is not really questioning or thinking through its decisions. So this is an idea that if you're sitting at a boardroom and you're all kind of like, okay, do we agree on this plan? And everyone's like, yeah, if they're agreeing, I'll agree, sure. But everyone's secretly realizing that it's a bad idea. So yeah, members aren't really thinking independently in these decisions. So if everyone else is agreeing, they're going to agree and go along with the group. Now, when I was making this lecture, I kind of delayed to make this because it's been a heavy week. And a lot of social psychology is often very much like, look how horrible we are to each other, right? So I'm going to end this lecture on some positive news instead. So I did some surfing through Reddit, human being bros, and I want to show you some positive things. I talked about all this negative stuff with protests and COVID and the way that people are, responding to each other with prejudice and whatnot. So here's a cool example from Flint, Michigan, of the sheriffs in those towns, protesting with the groups against themselves, kind of agreeing that there's problems in the police system and willingly marching alongside, listening to people who look different than him, um, and being willing to stand up against it. We saw a lot of this with mask wearing too. So um, there's an example from Pennsylvania where the workers volunteered to live at work for 28 days straight just to keep making PPE, protective equipment. And countless examples of individuals who learned how to sew masks, 3D print masks, whatever it is, because hospitals needed them. So people will rise up and step to that challenge when there's shortages. There's also this really cool story of this woman named Shirley Raines, who distributed hand sanitizer, vitamin C, etc., to individuals who are homeless. So she sat in her car, she maintained safe distance, she packaged these items, and she handed them out to anyone at the window who needed them. And then a ton, we all know that with job layoffs and whatnot, paying rent is increasingly harder. So there were good guy landlords who were like, hey, due to this pandemic, I'm going to waive rent. So stay safe, like help yourself, like realizing that people are humans first and not, greedily accepting, expecting money from people. This has happened countless times. Here's just one example um, of doctors and nurses and hospital workers who treat other people with COVID. Even if they don't have proper protective equipment, they're not selfishly, valuing their own life over others. So even going so far as to contract and lose their own battle with coronavirus because they were able to help so many others by doing so. And lastly, on a slightly lighter note, I thought this was cool. COVID has been so hard on academics. So having to do virtual remote learning is tough. Here's an example from someone who said, I didn't know how to solve a problem and I didn't have anybody to help me because of COVID. I couldn't go into a classroom, for instance. Their parents might not have been equipped to help them out. So a fellow Redditor made a YouTube video to teach him how to do it. So there is goodness in society as well. And sometimes I have to remind myself of that as things feel like they're, falling apart and on fire all the time. And I'm going to end on a quote from Mr. Rogers. He says, when I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, AKA all of 2020, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. So I think that's kind of a good takeaway of social psychology is that even if there are all these, negative prejudices, conformity, groupthink things, there are always good people too, people who are helping. So on that note, I'm going to wrap this up and let me know if you have any questions and I will see you at our next synchronous session. Bye guys.